So let's look at some of the reasons. This is more of a sort of vague, general sort of argument, I think, rather than detail. The first one is the notion of, we're actually, for US cities, you're reaching the limits of suburbanization. Once you start making them the big spread, and the American form in particular was a very thin spread. Right? That's fine in the 1950s and 1960s when gasoline is cheap and you have a lower valuation of time. The more people move out to this thin suburbanization, congestion begins to build up. You're spending more time traveling, commuting, and that becomes more problematic the more time becomes more valuable. So one is that there's a kind of extent that cities are going out so far, they're reaching almost the opposite of critical mass from the sense of like sustainability. The US in particular had been, US suburbanization was predicated on incredibly cheap gasoline. What do you say in Hong Kong? Petrol or gas? Petrol?
I say petrol.
Okay, whatever, petrol, gas. It was incredibly cheap. And so people were almost insensitive to transport costs, or indeed transport times. Fast forward, more and more people need to drive, the congestion costs are more, and gasoline prices go up. Now, it just so happens in the last year, the price of a barrel of oil has dipped well below $100. But nevertheless, the era of very cheap fuel is probably gone forever. The second one is changing demographics. That whole suburbanization thing was both constructed families and embodied family, like mom, dad, and the two kids. That's what the suburban thing was about. And that was often one of the reasons for making the trek to the suburbs. People put a higher valuation on children's education. And given the American system, when you moved from city to suburb, you were moving to a different school district, a better school district. So making the suburban move was really a sort of investment in your children. Well, one of the things that's been happening, as I'll show, is there's been a decline in mom, dad, and the two kids. Once you have more single person or non-child households, the move to the suburbs becomes less rational. The one thing, and it's the US, but around the world, is declining crime rates. One of the narratives of the 70s and the early 80s was that the cities as crime, as drug infested, especially in US cities, the crack epidemic really hits in the early 1980s. I'd seen there's all this sort of, Washington was the murder capital of the world, even more than Cali, Colombia, which I've been to, which was saying something. Well, that has transformed quite dramatically. I'll show you some figures for that. And once that begins to take hold, then the cities are no longer the narrative of someplace dangerous. Right? So you've moved from drug-infested, gang-ridden cities to cafe latte, yoga parlors, very different narrative. Right? So there's been a number of works about how an important cultural shift was, can anyone remember the show, sure my age now, anyone remember the show Friends? Friends, was that big in Hong Kong? Well, if you think about it, did anyone see that in Hong Kong? Friends? Okay. So think about Friends. If you looked at an incredibly popular television show, an incredibly popular television show in the 1950s was about a suburban family in the suburbs. Leave it to Beaver and various things. Moved to the 80s and early 1990s, the dominant kind of image is of young single people living in New York. The joke was, of course, is that one of the Phoebe worked in a coffee place, which is not incredibly, but it's not like working in investment banking, and she lives in a 1,500 square foot place in New York. It's like working in Starbucks and living in the best apartment in Hong Kong. That's why you know it's Hollywood, right, completely. Nevertheless, what was interesting was the sense of it moved the cultural dial. That living in New York was now seen as cool. So in other words, cities become cool and attractive. And it had a palpable effect. I spoke to admissions officers at universities, big urban, and they said things picked up. Applications to places like George Washington, which is in, or NYU in New York, picked up dramatically with that kind of influence of things like Friends. And then you saw what were cool adverts beginning to appear in the 1990s. It was always some guy in a loft, right? Converted loft. So this was the new cultural marker. Moving to the suburbs is what your parents did. But if you were cool and hip, you moved to an abandoned loft in the Lower East Side. Right? And that kind of, it's more than just, the kind of cultural forms are more than just epiphenomenon. They influence people's attitudes. There's also kind of new urban economics, and what I mean by that is a sense of a rise of, Alan Scott's referred to cognitive cultural capitalism, advanced producer services, which really begins to take off, and it has that whole urban agglomeration impact. Right? And there's also a revalorization of time and space, which shifts the focus away from the suburbs towards accessibility and towards more urban concentration. Now, some of these things may have a resonance, and some may not. So I'd be interested in the discussion, see what works for you guys and what doesn't. So the limits to suburbanization are clearly mounting traffic problems. Now, that was one of the unforeseen consequences. If you have a notion of, most of these suburbs are built in the idea of infinite mobility, right? The freeways, travel. When more and more people do that, the freeways become congested. Those might become congested at all times, for everything. So the congestion is not just at the rush hour, because people are making all these random moves. They're going to the mall, they're going to this, they're going to work, they're dropping their kids off. It's a sort of, rather than infinite mobility, which was the Le Corbusier notion, it becomes a sense of like permanent gridlock. And if you're spending more and more time in your car, traveling around, the cost of gasoline is going up, that your time is shrinking in a sense, and you're putting a higher valuation of time, which will come into, it becomes the limits of suburbanization. So that suburban dream, that promise of people driving in freeways, and you see the early images of the suburban promise was constantly moving, and that's kind of shrunk. It's become like very, very congested everywhere, and the cost of congestion has increased. So this is the changing demographics. I mean, I think it's always interesting. I always use Hong Kong or East Asia as one of those ones where you guys are already below replacement, right? I mean, what's the birth rate for? I mean, it should be, the replacement rate is 2.1 for everyone. What is it in Hong Kong? 1.2. 1.2. Yeah. You guys are making. Is anyone having sex in Hong Kong? They're having sex, they're just not having kids, right? And so, actually, I think Japan, Singapore, South Korea, Hong Kong, you're kind of way ahead of the curve in this. So this sense is, you guys kind of are familiar with this, but for the US, so 1970, 40% are married couples with children. Another 30% are married couples with children, right? Look at the women living alone. It's 11.5 in 1970. It just 15.2. Married couples with children shrinks from 40% to 20%. So when that happens, right, the demographic shift makes the suburbs no longer. Why would you move to the suburbs? You don't need the school districts anymore. You have less children. Do you want to schlep backwards and forwards to the suburbs? Why would you do that now? Single person household, right? Women and men living alone, only 15%. Now I'm looking at women living and men, 16%, and now we're up to almost 30%. So people living on their own. So 1 in 3 households. And when you look at smaller households, this is urban areas with the highest percentage of people living alone. Washington, D.C. is 48%, Atlanta 45%, New York 32%. really quite marked. Seattle, all those guys drinking coffee and, making Microsoft, they're all living in their apartments. And actually what's interesting is it's changing the nature of cities, because all those people living alone, every time they come home, they're coming home to dogs. So there's actually more pets now in cities than anything else. And actually that becomes an important political campaign. You wouldn't believe that, but there was a campaign in Washington, D.C., and it was basically between it's a predominantly black city, so the criticism of one of the candidates was he's for bike lanes and dog parks. And that was a criticism because that was he's for the yuppies, the gentrifiers. So dog lanes, bike lanes and dog parks is like the marker. It's all those kind of single people living on their own. They transform the kind of nature of the city. And it's a sense in which you're, then if you're a single living alone, you want to maximize your dating or potential marriage pool, right? And you do that where there's other young single people, and that's in the city. So it becomes like this kind of changing dynamic. And if you're a single living on your own, why would you live in the suburbs, right? I mean, your likelihood of meeting another single is quite kind of low. It's better to live where you're going to maximize your dating pool.